U.S. President Joe Biden has reiterated his support for permanent representation of Africa on the UN Security Council and for the African Union's permanent membership of the G20. He was addressing the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit in Washington during a session on good governance, democracy, respect for human rights, justice, and the rule of law.
Africa belongs to the table in every room where global challenges are being discussed, and in every institution where discussions are taking place. That's why I announced in September at the United Nations General Assembly that the United States fully supports reforming the UN Security Council to include permanent representation for Africa. And today I'm also calling for the African Union to join the G20 as a permanent member of the G20. It's been a long time in coming, but it's going to come.
Well, to unpack some of what's been happening this week, we're now joined by Professor James Gathii, who's a professor of law at the Loyola University Chicago School of Law in the United States. Prof, good to talk to you again. We spoke last week ahead of this gathering, and I just wonder, now that it's coming towards its end, your assessment. It seems as if the right things are being said.
Yes, thank you, Peter. Thank you for having me. And you're right, the right things seem to be being said. There was a lot of whining and dining as well, as you can imagine. My assessment is that Africa continues to occupy a really marginal place in U.S. policy. The total amount pledged over the last few days for trade, investment, security, and other matters is a paltry $50 billion only. If you compare that to the amount, and this is $50 billion over 3 years, if you compare that to the amount that comes to Africa from remittances, from Africans living outside the continent, it was $96 billion in 2021 alone. African expatriates and workers out of the continent are investing much more than the United States is committing to. If you compare that 50 billion to the amount of money that China invested in African infrastructure in 2020 was about 384 billion. If you compare that also to the amount of money that Africa loses in illicit financial flows from multinational corporations, it's a little over $80 billion. So just to give you a picture, in my view, of the really marginal commitment that the United States is making to Africa by announcing a mere $50 billion as the commitment over 3 years that the United States is willing to make for all of Africa's needs, not even to mention the amount of money that we need in terms of loss and damage, in terms of climate change and mitigation, just to mention one other example.
African leaders will know that this is not much of a contribution. Should they feel insulted then?
I think this is a complicated answer, as you can imagine, yeah. Peter. I think African leaders are very interested in the deals that the big companies, especially the digital companies that have been dominating many of the headlines in these meetings. Some of them are, in my view, personally invested in those deals. And so it's disappointing that there seems to be a lot of celebration among many delegations here in Washington, although many of them did not really get a lot of airtime with the president, who is busy attending to many other priorities here in the United States. I think President Kagame said it best when he was asked what has happened since the last U.S. Africa Leaders meeting. And he said, he laughed and said they had good meetings. And unfortunately, that might just be the case this time around. And just to add one final point here, I think one of the good things that has come out of this on the trade question, which we discussed before, is that African trade ministers spoke in one voice and held the line in terms of defending the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. So there was no talk really of U.S. Bilateral trade agreements with individual African countries. And secondly, they also spoke in one voice in support of the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act to be renewed in 2025. Those, I think, are important messages that were brought to Washington by the trade ministers. And in my view, those were successes in terms, at least for the moment, of holding the line to prevent bilateral free trade deals that I think would be inimical to the interests of many African economies.
The last time we spoke, we also talked about debt, and that is a big burden for many of our countries on the continent. Was that even discussed?
It doesn't seem that it featured much. There was a lot of discussion today about President Biden seeking $21 billion from Congress to be appropriated to the IMF, so that the International Monetary Fund can then disburse those funds to African economies to help them as a result of the fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic. But some of the signature topics relating to debt that might be consequential did not seem to have featured much, at least in the big debates and discussions in the big public forums that were broadcast. Several leaders did meet officials of the World Bank in the individual capacity, and sometimes it's difficult to know whether these were just photo ops or relation building opportunities that may set the basis for those kinds of difficult conversations. And just to add one last point here, when we spoke last, I think that the United States is trying to do a lot of symbolic gestures, like adding Africa to the G20 or supporting Africa's membership to the Security Council, the United Nations Security Council. These are merely symbolic gestures. They are like musical chairs. You're not changing the basic infrastructure and decision-making within these bodies that makes it impossible for Africa to participate on an equal footing. So, for example, in the International Monetary Fund, African economies only have a 6% voting share, which means that their voice and vote is just that small. So unless we are speaking about fundamentally changing the voting structure to give these economies a vote and voice that equals about their 30% membership in that body, they'll continue to be marginal. And the Western countries like the United States will continue to make symbolic gestures that do not change the nature of how these institutions function inconsistently with African interests.
You mentioned the Security Council. I mean, the reality is, I can promise to support your bid, but they know that the other members are not going to go for it. So they end up looking like heroes. Meanwhile, they know that they won't have to deal with the reality of it ever coming to being.
That's very true. And we know that the U.S. has lost its leadership role in multilateral organizations like the United Nations. Its credibility has been badly dented by events here within the United States, but also by how especially the previous administration undermined global institutions. So you're right that it's very unlikely that the United States would be able to carry favor with the 4 other members of the Security Council to have Africa included in the Security Council, even just for the simple reason that it would mean also having Latin America, the Caribbean, the other regions that are not represented, the South Pacific, that are not represented in the Security Council. And that's why this sounds to me like a very empty gesture, just like adding Africa to the G20.
Yeah. So when we look back then, essentially when our leaders come back to the continent and address us, they won't have very much in their luggage in terms of gifts coming back to Africa.
Well, perhaps they're going to have gifts for their families for the holiday season, but not for the rest of the citizenry.
All right, perhaps a small issue, I don't know, but I just wonder about the optics. Could President Biden have done the U.S. Africa Summit in Africa and not get 50 plus leaders to go all the way to America to him?
Well, that's a very good point, Peter. I think that that would have been much more ideal. I understand that he has promised to visit Africa and that several members of the cabinet, the U.S. cabinet, will also visit Africa in the coming months. Vice President Harris, he said, will also be visiting Africa. It's unclear whether there's going to be any consequential projects or announcements that they're going to be making when they come, or whether they're just be coming to inspect the projects that they announced this week, which, as I said, in terms of scope and scale, pale first in relation to the needs of the continent, but also secondly, in relation to the other big unspoken issue this week in Washington, D.C., which is, of course, the fact that China, by and far, is the dominant trading partner, as well as the leading investor on the continent, and also one of the countries that's opening its borders to African trade without any barriers. And just to finish on that, just today, China announced a duty-free regime for Ethiopian goods that compares very favorably with the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act of the United States. And there are no conditions attached to it, unlike the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act that is going to expire in 2025 and that will require renewal here in the United States.
Professor Gathii, always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much indeed for giving us some reflection on this Africa-US Summit. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Peter, for having me.
Thank you. All right, so that's Professor James Gathii, who's a professor of law at Loyola University in Chicago in the US, talking about the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, which he says all the right things were said. America has promised $50 billion, but that's a fraction compared to countries like China, who are really upping their game in terms of investing and creating an enabling environment for trade with China.